Rhea County, Tennessee, autumn of 1876. A thin mist clung to the forested hollows as Marshal Nathaniel Guthrie approached the Byrd homestead. The cabin sat low against the mountainside, timbers weathered gray, chimney smoke curling lazily into the sky. Even from the lane, the building felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves kept secrets. Guthrie's boots crunched over damp leaves. He had heard rumors, whispers about a family living apart from the world, but nothing could have prepared him for what he found. Mercy Byrd opened the door. She was tall, wary, her dark braids hanging over a partially deaf left ear. Behind her lingered Temperance Byrd, her limp noticeable, and Clarity Byrd, the youngest, her eyes wide but steady. "Marshal, we've been waiting. You need to understand, Father. He believes God gave him certain rights. He's different," Mercy said. "I need you to tell me everything. Every detail matters," Guthrie replied, keeping his voice calm. Mercy hesitated, then spoke with a casual tone that made the words chilling. "Mountain law, it's not town law. Abraham had wives. Jacob had wives. Father, he believes the same." Guthrie studied the sisters carefully. Physical markers, subtle but telling, suggested more than ordinary hardship. Mercy's hearing loss, Temperance's clubfoot, Clarity's frail body, each told a story of abuse and isolation. "Have you ever been harmed by him?" Guthrie asked. All three nodded. Prudence, she bore 2 stillborn twins in 1868. Another baby in 1870 lived only 3 days. She died in November 1875 from complications of a 4th pregnancy. Mercy said quietly. "Where are the children buried?" Guthrie asked. Temperance pointed toward the back of the barn. Behind the barn, with Prudence. From the cellar below, Ezekiel Byrd's voice shouted, audible through the trapdoor. "I keep the line pure! Abraham had Sarah and Hagar, Jacob had Rachel and Leah." Isolation means older covenant. Mercy looked at Guthrie. "He's been saying that for 14 years. He truly believes it." The Clarity spoke softly but steadily. "We wanted him to understand what it's like to be owned, to have no control over your own body or life. We wanted him conscious and aware every single day." The Temperance added, "Why never struck him? We never touched him wrong. We just kept him the way he kept us." Guthrie began a systematic search of the homestead while Hobbs, his deputy, stayed with the sisters. In Ezekiel Byrd's bedroom, he discovered a leather-bound journal that would become Prosecution Exhibit C. It contained 89 pages of entries dating from November 1863 to October 1876, written in careful script that demonstrated education unusual for isolated mountain farmers. Each entry documented which daughter had performed what Byrd called wily duties, accompanied by scriptural passages he claimed justified his acts. Sample entries cited Genesis 19 regarding Lot's daughters and references to Abraham, Jacob, and patriarchal marriage customs. The meticulous documentation proved Byrd understood exactly what he was doing, constructing an elaborate theological justification rather than acting from ignorance. But the most damning evidence lay hidden in the family Bible, a massive King James edition sitting on the parlor table. The interior pages had been hollowed out to create a hiding space. Inside lay another journal, written in smaller, more desperate handwriting. The first page bore the name Prudence Byrd and a date November 15, 1863. "Mama died today, birthing Clarity. Papa says we are alone now. I am 11 years old. I do not understand what he means." The first entry read. Guthrie's hands trembled as he turned pages, realizing he held testimony from beyond the grave. Prudence had documented 12 years of systematic abuse. Marshal Guthrie read aloud from the entries to establish evidentiary value, while the 3 surviving sisters listened without visible emotion. Early entries showed a child's confusion transforming into horrified understanding. December 1863, "Papa came to my room last night. He said, 'Mama used to sleep with him, and now I must.' It hurt very much. I cried, but he said I must be silent or I would wake my sisters." By January 1864, Prudence wrote, "Papa says we cannot go to church anymore because town people would not understand mountain ways. He says we are like the patriarchs in the wilderness. That isolation means we follow older laws than town laws. The progression chronicled abuse beginning immediately after their mother's death, intensifying as each sister reached adolescence. Prudence recorded entire conversations in which Ezekiel explained his interpretation of Scripture, citing Abraham's relationship with Hagar, Lot's daughters preserving their father's line, and Jacob's multiple wives as precedent for his so-called patriarchal covenant. I looked up these stories in Mama's Bible, she wrote. I do not think Papa is reading them correctly, but I am only 12 and he says, children cannot question fathers. Dr. Horace Apprentice, the county physician, later testified that Prudence's literacy and analytical thinking demonstrated intelligence, making her documentation particularly credible. She wasn't simply recording events, she was questioning the theological framework her father used to justify them. By June 1865, Prudence wrote, Papa started visiting Mercy's room last month when she turned 14. I hear her crying through the wall. She asked me if Papa does the same to me. I told her yes. We held each other and cried. Papa heard us and beat us both for gossiping about family matters. He said, if we ever speak of this to each other again, he will chain us in the root cellar. By August 1867, he had begun visiting Temperance, who was 13. Prudence noted, she limps worse now, I think, from trying to run from him. We are not permitted to speak of what happens, but we all know we are trapped. Prudence documented her own pregnancies, providing medical evidence crucial to the prosecution. In November 1867, my monthly courses have stopped. I am 19. I believe I am with child. Papa says this is proof God approves of our family's ways. The pregnancy ended in March 1868 with stillborn twins. A second pregnancy in 1869 resulted in a daughter who lived only 3 days. Prudence's description of complications, graphic enough to shock medical experts, matched inbreeding, related deformities she sketched in the margins. Prudence's final entries, dated November 1875, were written just days before her death. I am dying. I can feel it. The baby inside me is killing me, and I am glad because it means escape. But my sisters will remain trapped. Mercy is strong. Temperance is clever. Clarity is young but braver than she knows. I have told them where this journal is hidden. I have told them everything is recorded here. Every date, every act, every justification Papa used. Make him pay for what he has done to us. After reading these entries, Guthrie immediately requested Dr. Apprentice travel to conduct medical examinations of the 3 surviving sisters. The report documented scarring, partially healed fractures, malnutrition, and signs of hereditary defects consistent with inbreeding. Psychological assessments demonstrated trauma, but not insanity. The sisters had survived through extraordinary resilience rather than mental defect. Guthrie located Bethany Crockett, the midwife who attended Prudence's failed pregnancies in 1868 and 1870, initially refusing to speak. Crockett broke down when Guthrie read passages from Prudence's journal. She admitted seeing deformities in Prudence's children, consistent with inbreeding, noting she had been bribed to remain silent. I left those girls to suffer. I will answer to God for that cowardice, she testified. Mercy provided a detailed account of the sisters' revenge. After Prudence's death in November 1875, they held a council in the barn. Temperance recalled, "We knew Clarity would be next. She was 12 and Papa had started watching her the way he watched each of us. We couldn't let Prudence's death be meaningless. She documented everything, so there would be proof. We decided Papa needed to understand what it meant to be property, to be owned, to have no control over your own body or life." For nearly a year, the sisters planned their methodical revenge. They studied herbs in their mother's garden, calculating dosages of foxglove to render their father unconscious without killing him. On the evening of October 28, 1876, Mercy added foxglove tea to his coffee, disguised with honey. Ezekiel drank it while reading scripture aloud, lecturing on obedience and authority. Within 20 minutes, he showed dizziness, slurred speech, and confusion. Clarity watched as he realized something was wrong. "What have you done?" he asked. Mercy replied, "What you taught us to do." We obeyed. They caught him before he fell, dragging him across the kitchen floor to the root cellar. The sisters, weighing collectively about 300 pounds, maneuvered their father's 200-pound body down the ladder, chaining him with instruments he had used to threaten them for years. They provided only enough food and water to survive, cleaning his waist twice weekly. No blankets, no warmth. Each night, they prayed aloud for Prudence's soul, letting the sound of their voices carry through the floorboards to the darkness below. Psychological torment replaced physical harm, forcing Ezekiel to feel the helplessness he had imposed on his daughters. Over the months, he raged, bargained, wept, and promised reform. But the sisters recognized the patterns of manipulation. Mercy recorded every feeding and every reaction, mirroring her father's meticulous documentation. The purpose was not murder, it was deliberate imprisonment to ensure he faced the consequences of his own cruelty. The evidence they created, the journals, medical examinations, midwife testimony, and the chains themselves, formed an unbroken chain of proof. Each element corroborated the others, leaving no room for doubt that the sisters' actions stemmed from calculated justice rather than impulsive rage. By the time Guthrie left the homestead, he carried with him the instruments of documentation, witness affidavits, and the sisters' testimonies, all of which would form the backbone of the prosecution against Ezekiel Byrd. The Byrd sisters, though scarred and haunted, had turned the tools of their oppression into instruments of accountability, ensuring that the truth of 14 years of isolation, abuse, and betrayal could no longer be hidden. The trial of Ezekiel Byrd began on a bright spring morning, the courthouse in Rhea County crowded beyond capacity. Over 200 spectators filled the room, some having traveled days to witness the unfolding case. Newspapers had painted it as the most disturbing family crime in Tennessee history, a story of isolation, abuse, and calculated vengeance that forced the public to confront horrors, usually hidden in mountain hollows. Ezekiel Byrd sat in the defendant's chair, clean clothes replacing the ragged garments he had worn in the cellar. His appearance suggested an attempt at dignity, but the hardened expression beneath his graying hair betrayed a lifetime of rigid certainty. Marcus Thornton, the defense attorney, had taken the case reluctantly, fully aware that representing Byrd risked professional ruin. Across the aisle, District Attorney Samuel Brennan prepared to present evidence that would become legendary in legal circles. Brennan opened not with the sensational account of Byrd's imprisonment, but by reading from Prudence Byrd's hidden journal. The courtroom fell silent as the entries unfolded, beginning with the child's first realization of loss and confusion. "Mama died today, birthing clarity. Papa says we are alone now. I am 11 years old. I do not understand what he means." Each line traced Prudence's transformation from innocent child to a survivor who understood the full measure of her father's cruelty. The gallery reacted immediately. Women wept openly, men turned pale, some leaving the room entirely. Judge Amos Whitfield, a veteran of nearly 4 decades on the bench, maintained a stern composure, though later reports noted he had wiped his eyes as Brennan reached the final entries describing Prudence's death. The young woman had recorded not just abuse, but the meticulous reasoning behind each act, the deliberate theological framework her father used to justify systematic violation of his daughters. After 2 hours, Brennan presented Byrd's own journal, contrasting Prudence's desperate hope with Ezekiel's cold calculations. Sample entries documented discipline framed as divine mandate, with references to Genesis and patriarchal obedience. The meticulous dates allowed prosecutors to cross-reference his claims with Prudence's recordings, proving he had documented the same acts while framing them as religious duty rather than criminal abuse. Dr. Horace Apprentice's testimony reinforced the documentation. Across 2 days, he presented clinical evidence that corroborated both journals. Bruises, healed fractures, reproductive trauma, and hereditary markers, consistent with inbreeding, formed a medical narrative, confirming Prudence's written account. When Thornton questioned whether medical evidence could reliably assess historical abuse, Apprentice responded with unwavering certainty. He had practiced medicine for 25 years, seen the effects of poverty, accidents, and hereditary conditions, and none matched the systematic trauma exhibited by the Byrd sisters. This is evidence of prolonged sexual abuse and its genetic impact, he said. The sisters are not insane. They survived through intelligence, resilience, and deliberate action. The Marshal Guthrie's testimony established the investigative timeline. He described finding Ezekiel in the cellar, discovering both journals, interviewing the sisters, and collecting physical evidence including chains, padlocks, and photographs of the cellar's conditions. Thornton attempted to discredit Guthrie, claiming federal overreach, but Judge Whitfield dismissed the argument. Tennessee law clearly recognized incest, rape, and abuse of minors as crimes regardless of geographic isolation or cultural codes. The court would not permit theological or cultural rationalizations to excuse documented evil. The prosecution's strategic highlight came when the chains used to imprison Ezekiel were brought into the courtroom. Neck irons, ankle restraints, and heavy chains were placed before the jury. The sound of iron striking wood echoed through the chamber. Brennan pointed out wear patterns, rust, and padlock mechanisms, emphasizing that these were the same instruments Ezekiel had threatened the sisters with for years. When Ezekiel was called to the stand, the display of evidence became even more devastating. Under oath, Ezekiel admitted recognition of the chains and their use in both livestock and equipment securing. When asked if he had threatened his daughters with these instruments, he answered openly, "A father has the right to discipline his children." He referenced Proverbs, insisting he taught godly respect for paternal authority. Brennan allowed this statement to settle over the courtroom, before pointing out the logical consequence. The daughters had simply used their father's own tools against him. The jury absorbed the significance of the testimony. Ezekiel had framed terror and control as moral instruction, and the victims had executed justice with clarity and precision. Thornton had hoped to present his client as a misunderstood patriarch, but Ezekiel's testimony revealed unwavering conviction and complete lack of remorse. He claimed divine sanction for actions that amounted to sexual abuse of minors, asserting that isolation from town society required adherence to older, purer laws. When pressed about Prudence's death, he dismissed it as natural, writing it off as God's will. Every word he spoke reinforced the prosecution's narrative. The sisters had acted rationally in the face of intolerable abuse. Brennan then directed attention to the sisters themselves. Mercy, Temperance, and Clarity testified in detail about the planning and execution of their father's confinement. They described the calculation of herbal doses, the strategic use of the cellar, and the meticulous documentation of his imprisonment. Mercy read aloud portions of her own records, food portions, cleaning schedules, and daily observations. The sisters had mirrored the methodical record keeping Ezekiel had employed against them, transforming tools of subjugation into instruments of evidence. The jury listened as Clarity described her father's initial rage, bargaining, and eventual pleas for release. The psychological toll was evident. Ezekiel was forced to endure helplessness, discomfort, and isolation, experiencing in microcosm the torment he had inflicted on his daughters. Temperance explained the logic behind each decision: no death, no mercy, no relief, just controlled suffering to reflect the years of abuse. Every night, the sisters' prayers for Prudence's soul punctuated the cellar's darkness, a reminder of the child who had documented the evidence that now secured their case. The prosecution highlighted the careful, alignment of evidence. Prudence's journal, Ezekiel's own writings, medical documentation, Crockett's midwife testimony, and the chains themselves. Each corroborated the other, forming a narrative impossible to dismiss. Experts confirmed hereditary deformities consistent with incest, while medical assessments showed trauma consistent with sexual abuse. Witnesses verified that community members had knowledge of the abuse, but failed to intervene, emphasizing the isolation and helplessness the sisters had endured. Brennan's closing arguments focused on justice, morality, and the careful distinction between vengeance and retribution. He reminded the jury that the Byrd sisters had not acted out of madness or malice. They had survived through reasoned planning, transforming their father's methods of control into evidence to ensure accountability. The courtroom was silent, each juror visibly grappling with the magnitude of 14 years of abuse and the deliberate, intelligent response of the victims. Thornton's defense unraveled completely. He attempted to invoke misinterpretation of scripture and patriarchal misguidance as mitigating factors, but the jury had seen the evidence firsthand. Ezekiel's own testimony confirmed premeditation, awareness of wrongdoing, and an absolute belief in his righteousness. Cultural codes could not excuse crimes clearly recognized as abuse. After deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that made headlines across the staple. Guilty on all counts. Ezekiel Byrd was sentenced to life imprisonment. His daughters exonerated for actions that had preserved evidence, protected one another, and ensured the full measure of justice could be applied. Reporters described the courtroom atmosphere as tense but triumphant, a rare instance in which meticulous documentation, community witnesses, and expert testimony combined to bring a remote horror into the light of law. The Byrd sisters emerged from the courthouse with the weight of years lifted. Those scars remained. They had acted as rational agents, not vengeful lunatics, and the legal system had finally recognized the truth. Outside, the air was fresh and untainted, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the homestead, where they had lived under their father's control. They had not only survived, they had ensured that Prudence's story would not be forgotten. In the months following the trial, the sisters returned to a semblance of ordinary life. They maintained quiet routines, repaired relationships with extended family who had been unaware or unwilling to act, and slowly reclaimed autonomy over their bodies and choices. Medical follow-ups addressed long-term trauma, while their courage inspired local discourse about isolation, abuse, and accountability. Schools and churches began referencing the case in discussions about child protection, and local midwives and community members were warned that silence could no longer be a shield for perpetrators. The story of the Byrd sisters became a cautionary tale, not of malice, but of the extraordinary resilience of victims who transformed oppression into justice. Their meticulous documentation, strategic planning, and unwavering commitment to truth proved that intellect and courage could overcome even the most entrenched abuse. Prudence's journal, hidden for years in a hollowed Bible, remained a testament to foresight and survival, a record of suffering that became a blueprint for vindication. Years later, historians and legal scholars would revisit the case, analyzing every entry, testimony, and piece of evidence. They marveled at how the sisters maintained clarity under pressure, how methodical their planning had been, and how the intersection of faith, law, and moral courage had culminated in the first time such a systematic abuse case had been prosecuted successfully in the state. Scholars noted that the Byrd sisters had rewritten the narrative of victimhood, demonstrating that survival could include intelligence, patience, and an unwavering sense of justice. The Byrd homestead, once a place of fear and torment, gradually faded into memory, reclaimed by forest and time. Yet the legacy of Prudence's journal, the medical reports, and the courtroom drama remained. The tale of the sisters, who had endured 14 years of abuse, then carefully orchestrated their father's confinement to secure justice, persisted in local lore and court archives alike. Through it all, mercy, temperance, and clarity lived with a quiet dignity, carrying both trauma and triumph. They had ensured the truth would outlive them, that no girl would suffer in silence the way they had, and that justice, however delayed, could prevail when courage, intellect, and persistence were applied. Life after the trial did not erase the memories of the Byrd sisters, nor did it fully heal the deep scars left by years of abuse. Yet in their quiet moments, each found small measures of strength in the lives they were rebuilding. Mercy took on the responsibility of chronicling what had occurred, ensuring Prudence's original journal, along with her own detailed notes, remained preserved. She wrote with care, aware that history often forgets the voices of the powerless, unless someone insists on recording the truth. Temperance immersed herself in study, determined to understand herbal medicine beyond what their mother had taught them, transforming knowledge, once used to poison their father, into a force for life and healing. Clarity, the youngest, leaned into art and storytelling, attempting to capture the complex emotions of their ordeal in drawings and short narratives that mirrored the meticulousness Prudence had shown years before. The sisters' notoriety spread beyond Tennessee. Scholars, journalists, and legal theorists debated the morality and strategy behind their actions. Many questioned the ethics of holding Ezekiel Byrd alive for 14 months, weighing the calculated psychological punishment against the heinous crimes he had committed. Yet, in every discussion, it became clear that the sisters had acted with deliberate precision, intelligence, and moral reasoning, not out of impulse or vengeance. They had made a conscious choice to allow the law to intervene while simultaneously preserving evidence that would prove his guilt. Local communities, once complicit through silence, slowly began to confront their role in the Byrd case. Midwives, neighbors, and distant relatives faced scrutiny, and conversations about the Mountain Code, traditions that had long excused inaction, were now accompanied by the chilling realities of unchecked abuse. Bethany Crockett, the midwife, carried guilt for the remainder of her life, but she also helped educate others, sharing knowledge about recognizing abuse and providing medical intervention when necessary. Her delayed testimony, once considered a weakness, became part of the historical understanding of how societal norms can trap both victims and bystanders in cycles of silence. The sisters maintained strict boundaries with outsiders, carefully filtering who could enter their lives. Trust had to be earned slowly. Betrayal had been a constant in their formative years. Yet, they found allies among progressive legal minds, women's rights advocates, and sympathetic local officials who recognized the unprecedented nature of their ordeal. Lectures, interviews, and private discussions allowed the sisters to educate others on the signs of abuse, the importance of documentation, and the strategies survivors could employ to protect themselves without escalating immediate risk. Each public interaction was carefully controlled, a demonstration of autonomy and agency they had been denied for so long. Years passed, and the memory of Ezekiel Byrd in his chains faded into legend. He remained in prison, largely forgotten by the world outside, an isolated figure reflecting the consequences of his own rigid beliefs and cruelty. The sisters occasionally revisited the homestead, now overgrown and reclaimed by nature, to gather herbs, preserve relics, and honor Prudence's memory. These visits were not nostalgic but ritualistic, a way to process grief, reclaim territory, and mark their survival against the darkness that had dominated their early lives. They cleaned the barn, removed debris, and carefully documented their findings, continuing the meticulous approach to life that had kept them alive. Psychologically, the sisters worked through their trauma in different ways. Mercy often spent hours alone, reading scripture and Prudence's journal side by side, attempting to reconcile faith with the horrors perpetrated in the name of religion. Temperance experimented with herbal remedies and teaching younger generations about their uses. transforming knowledge, once used as a weapon, into a tool for healing. Clarity, though the youngest, displayed remarkable emotional resilience, often serving as a mediator when memories threatened to overwhelm her older sisters. Together, they built a support network rooted in mutual understanding, empathy, and vigilance, cultivating a bond that could not be broken by years of manipulation or violence. Legal historians later examined the case as a milestone in the evolution of child protection law. The Byrd sisters demonstrated that evidence could come in forms beyond eyewitness testimony. Journals, medical records, and detailed self-documentation could prove beyond doubt a pattern of abuse. Prosecutors used the case as a blueprint, noting the importance of methodical investigation, expert testimony, and physical evidence when pursuing crimes hidden by isolation or cultural codes. The sisters' strategy became an unlikely lesson in forensic precision. When survivors meticulously record events, even the most hidden crimes can be brought to light and justice enforced. Despite fame and scholarly attention, the sisters preferred solitude. They corresponded with distant relatives and sympathetic supporters. But their primary focus remained the ongoing preservation of Prudence's journal and their own records. These documents served both as memorials and warnings, evidence that systematic abuse could occur anywhere, even in the seeming safety of family, and that intelligence, planning, and courage could counter even the most entrenched tyranny. As the decades progressed, the Byrd sisters aged into quiet, dignified figures within their community. Their story became folklore in the Appalachian region, a mixture of cautionary tale and heroic survival. Teachers recounted their experiences in literature and social studies, emphasizing courage, resilience, and the importance of speaking truth to power. Students who once read only sanitized versions of local history were confronted with the stark reality of abuse and the complex morality of the sisters' actions. Prudence's journal, carefully preserved in a local historical society, became a primary source for legal studies, anthropology, and women's history, analyzed alongside the testimony of medical and law enforcement professionals. While the world outside often focused on the shocking nature of the crime, the sisters themselves prioritized the lessons learned, the power of foresight, the importance of documenting events, and the necessity of precise, deliberate action in the face of impossible circumstances. Mercy reflected that the planning, the record-keeping, and the careful management of their father's confinement had not only ensured justice, but had also given them a sense of control they had been denied for so long. Temperance considered the herbs and household knowledge she had inherited, realizing that wisdom could be weaponized, but also redeemed for good. Clarity continued to channel her observations into art, capturing emotions words could not convey, preserving the human experience of trauma, resilience, and liberation. The sisters' legacy extended beyond their own survival. Communities became more vigilant, midwives and neighbors were more willing to intervene, and the case influenced legislation regarding the protection of minors in isolated regions. Historians highlighted that the Byrd sisters' survival and calculated response had rewritten the narrative of victimhood. Victims could be intelligent, strategic, and morally aware, capable of taking measured action to ensure both immediate survival and long-term justice. In the quiet of their later years, the Byrd sisters often spoke of Prudence. They honored her foresight, courage, and the moral clarity that had guided them even after her death. They tended to the homestead one last time before leaving it permanently abandoned, the forest slowly consuming the traces of a lifetime of secrecy and suffering. Yet, in the historical records, in preserved journals, and in the memories of those who had studied the case, Prudence's voice remained unbroken, a guiding presence for all three sisters, and for generations who would later confront the realities of abuse, isolation, and the power of documentation. Even in the face of such darkness, the sisters had found a measure of peace. They had survived, educated, and protected each other. The story of the Byrd sisters became a testament to human resilience, strategic thinking, and the moral imperative to transform victimhood into a force for justice. In time, their tale passed into legend, both a warning and an inspiration, proving that even in the most dire circumstances, intellect, courage, and perseverance could prevail. Despite the notoriety and attention that followed their trial, the Byrd sisters remained acutely aware of the fragility of freedom. Even as the public lauded their courage and strategy, they understood that trust was earned only through careful observation and constant vigilance. They moved deliberately through life, avoiding unnecessary attachments and carefully managing the few relationships they allowed. Outsiders were met with polite detachment, curiosity or intrusion was met with measured silence. Each sister understood that the world beyond the mountains could be as dangerous in its own way as the world they had survived. Mercy often revisited the journals, both Prudence's and her own, not out of obsession, but from a sense of duty. Each page reminded her that their survival had been built on careful record keeping, foresight, and unyielding attention to detail. She frequently compared her notes to the original entries, verifying that nothing had been lost, and adding reflections about lessons learned. These reflections were practical as much as they were emotional strategies for avoiding exploitation, techniques for observing human behavior, and careful accounting of moral choices in situations of extreme duress. In a sense, Mercy had become both archivist and moral philosopher, translating the horrors of their past into a framework for understanding human cruelty, resilience, and justice. Temperance devoted herself to practical knowledge. She studied herbs, medicines, and remedies far beyond what she had inherited from her mother, combining intuition with experimentation. Her work was meticulous, cautious, and deliberate. Where once she had used herbal knowledge to incapacitate, she now used it to heal. Communities sought her counsel quietly, respecting her privacy, while benefiting from her expertise. She also taught local girls about the natural world, instilling lessons about observation, calculation, and prudence. Her lessons were subtle but enduring, an extension of the survival skills that had saved their lives. Clarity, whose youth had once made her the target of predation, channeled her experiences into art. She produced sketches and watercolors that depicted the mountains, the homestead, and abstract representations of fear, captivity, and freedom. Her art was deeply personal, but resonated with those who understood trauma and recovery. Over time, her works were collected by historians, psychologists, and anthropologists, studying the psychological impact of long-term abuse and the resilience of survivors. Through her visual storytelling, Clarity translated the ineffable, pain, courage, and defiance, into tangible, haunting images that spoke across generations. The sisters also grappled with moral questions that lingered long after their father's conviction. Though the legal system had ruled in their favor, they frequently debated whether holding him alive for 14 months had been justified. Discussions were intense and private, each sister offering perspectives shaped by personal experience and ethical reasoning. They concluded that their actions, measured and deliberate as they had been, were necessary to ensure both justice and proof. Mercy argued that instantaneous retribution would have left the law unable to intervene, and the truth might have been obscured. Temperance noted that the act itself had forced Ezekiel to confront the consequences of his abuse, something he had refused to acknowledge for decades. Clarity emphasized the importance of survival, and that careful action had allowed them to endure and protect one another. These conversations, conducted long after the trial, reflected a rare combination of intellect, morality, and pragmatism that defined the sisters' approach to life. Local folklore grew around the sisters' story. Travelers and historians would recount the tale in hushed tones: the intelligent daughters who had outmaneuvered a tyrant, the journals that bore witness, and the chains that had once held them captive now turned into instruments of justice. In many retellings, Prudence was elevated to almost mythic status, her foresight and courage the cornerstone of the narrative. The sisters, however, resisted mythologizing themselves. They were acutely aware that the line between heroism and necessity was thin. Their goal had always been survival and justice, not fame, and they remained careful to preserve that distinction. Over time, the sisters contributed anonymously to local archives, ensuring that their story would remain accessible for future generations without compromising their privacy. Mercy's additions to Prudence's journal included reflections on law, morality, and survival strategy, creating a layered historical record that intertwined lived experience with philosophical insight. These writings would later serve as foundational texts for studies in forensic history, gender studies, and Appalachian sociology, though the sisters themselves never sought recognition. Psychologically, the sisters continued to experience echoes of trauma. Nightmares, sudden flashbacks, and moments of anxiety were frequent, but they had developed coping mechanisms over decades. Meditation, focused work, and deliberate reflection became tools to maintain equilibrium. The memory of the cellar, of chains, and of the prolonged captivity of their father was never forgotten, but it was reframed as a symbol of justice rather than fear. By confronting it directly, documenting it carefully, and integrating it into their moral and practical frameworks, they transformed what had once been a site of terror into a site of learning and empowerment. The Byrd sisters also influenced broader societal discussions about abuse, isolation, and the limits of patriarchal authority. Their story was cited in legal seminars, social work courses, and community discussions about child protection and ethical intervention. Scholars examined the sisters' methods, not only as survival strategy, but as a form of moral reasoning under extreme constraints. Their actions became case studies in the intersection of legality, ethics, and survival, highlighting how victims of systemic abuse can exercise agency without descending into chaos or lawlessness. In private, the sisters occasionally spoke of the future, speculating about what life could have been if Prudence had survived, or if their mother had not died when she did. These reflections were tinged with sorrow but tempered by gratitude. They recognized that the intelligence, resilience, and moral reasoning that Prudence had modeled had enabled their survival. In that sense, she lived on not only through preserved documents, but in the actions, decisions, and ethical frameworks of her surviving sisters. As the years passed, Mercy, Temperance, and Clarity witnessed changes in the world around them. Mountain communities began to adopt more proactive approaches to child welfare. Legal frameworks evolved to provide greater protection, and educational initiatives spread awareness of signs of abuse. The Byrd case, though infamous, catalyzed meaningful reform. The sisters took quiet satisfaction in knowing that their actions had reverberated far beyond their isolated homestead. The sisters eventually settled into a rhythm defined by autonomy and careful observation. Mercy continued her archiving, Temperance her herbal practice and teaching, and Clarity her art. They maintained a cautious distance from outsiders, but when they engaged, it was with precision and intention. Each choice, from a casual conversation to an act of mentorship, was deliberate, informed by years of experience with power, control, and survival. They remained vigilant, protective of one another, and committed to ethical action, recognizing that freedom demanded ongoing effort. Prudence's journal, along with Mercy's careful annotations, became the sisters' most treasured possession. Beyond its historical significance, it served as a moral compass and a reminder of the intelligence and courage required to survive under tyranny. The act of writing, of documenting with precision and reflection, had been a tool for survival, empowerment, and justice, a legacy that would continue long after their lifetimes. Even in solitude, the sisters found moments of connection, laughter, and reflection. Small rituals, such as tending the garden, preparing meals together, or quietly reading, became acts of resistance against the trauma that had once defined their existence. These routines reinforced a sense of control and autonomy, demonstrating that life, even after profound abuse, could contain beauty, purpose, and resilience. The Byrd sisters' story, passed down through journals, testimonies, and local memory, remained a testament to the complexity of human morality, the power of intelligence and planning, and the resilience of those who endure systematic oppression. It illustrated that survival was not merely physical, but intellectual, emotional, and moral, and that justice could be pursued through courage, documentation, and unwavering ethical reasoning. The mountains, once a prison, eventually became a sanctuary. The sisters walked their homestead with measured steps, aware of every shadow, every tree, every hidden corner. Nature had reclaimed much of the land, and in doing so, offered a symbolic cleansing, an assertion that life and growth could persist despite years of cruelty. They honored Prudence's memory in quiet ways, by recording what they witnessed, tending the land, and maintaining the disciplined, deliberate routines that had once saved their lives. Through decades of careful living, reflection, and preservation, mercy, temperance, and clarity ensured that their story, Prudence's courage, and the evidence of their father's crimes remained accessible to history. They transformed trauma into documentation, fear into strategy, and victimhood into survival. Their legacy was not simply a tale of horror, but a blueprint for resilience, moral reasoning, and ethical action under extreme duress. Even as the world changed, the Byrd sisters remained vigilant, precise, and enduring, a quiet force of justice shaped by intellect, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Years passed, and the Byrd sisters settled into a life marked by deliberate control and thoughtful observation. Despite the notoriety surrounding their case, they chose a quiet existence, one that emphasized autonomy and purpose. The mountains, once a place of confinement and terror, had become a sanctuary where they could reclaim the rhythms of daily life on their own terms. Every action was measured, every choice considered. They understood the fragility of freedom and the vigilance it required. Mercy remained the family archivist, her meticulous habit of documentation continuing long after the trials concluded. She reviewed Prudence's original journal, alongside her own annotations, verifying accuracy and preserving context. Beyond mere record keeping, she reflected on the moral lessons embedded in each entry, crafting an internal framework for ethical reasoning under extreme circumstances. Prudence had taught them the importance of foresight, of observing patterns of behavior, and of recording events with precision. Mercy ensured these lessons would remain living principles, guiding their decisions and fortifying their resilience. Temperance deepened her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, transforming what had once been a tool for incapacitation into one for healing. She cultivated extensive gardens, experimented cautiously, and documented her findings in detailed notebooks. Her work attracted discreet attention from those who needed guidance, though she engaged selectively. Temperance also taught younger women about the natural world, imparting lessons in observation, patience, and prudence. Her instruction was practical, rooted in experience, and designed to empower others with knowledge that could protect and sustain life. Clarity turned her traumatic experiences into artistic expression. Her sketches and watercolors depicted the landscape of the mountains, abstract representations of fear and captivity, and the nuanced dynamics of power and control. Her work carried the weight of memory, but also the possibility of transformation, conveying complex emotions that words could not capture. Clarity's art gained recognition among scholars and psychologists studying trauma, resilience, and the human capacity to transform suffering into insight. Through her creations, she translated lived horror into a medium that educated, warned, and inspired empathy. Despite the passage of time, the sisters frequently revisited moral and ethical questions surrounding their actions. They debated whether keeping their father alive in the cellar had been justified, considering the consequences of both action and inaction. Mercy argued that proof and justice had necessitated a measured approach, ensuring that the law could intervene. Temperance emphasized that forcing Ezekiel to confront the consequences of his abuse had been a necessary act of moral reckoning. Clarity highlighted the importance of survival, noting that careful planning had preserved their lives and prevented further harm. These discussions were reflective, nuanced, and unsparing, demonstrating the sisters' capacity for complex moral reasoning under extraordinary circumstances. Their story became legend in the region, whispered among travelers, recounted in local histories, and studied by those interested in human behavior, justice, and the consequences of isolation. Prudence was often remembered as a figure of foresight and courage, her meticulous documentation considered both heroic and foundational. The sisters, however, resisted mythologizing. They were acutely aware that the line between necessity and heroism was narrow, and they understood that their survival depended on vigilance, intelligence, and ethical reasoning. Over time, the sisters contributed anonymously to archives and historical records, preserving the truth without seeking public recognition. Mercy's annotations on Prudence's journal expanded the historical context, including reflections on law, morality, and survival strategy. These writings would later serve as invaluable resources for scholars, historians, and social scientists, illustrating the interplay of trauma, resilience, and deliberate action. The sisters' careful preservation of history ensured that future generations could learn from their experiences without sensationalizing or misrepresenting them. Psychologically, the Byrd sisters continued to manage the lingering effects of trauma. Nightmares, flashbacks, and sudden anxiety were tempered by routines of reflection, work, and meditation. They confronted memories directly, integrating them into their moral and practical frameworks, transforming terror into lessons in resilience and ethical action. The memory of the cellar, once a symbol of oppression, became a reminder of their capacity for calculated justice and survival. They had taken what was a place of horror and transformed it into a framework for understanding, preparation, and empowerment. The sisters' influence extended beyond their immediate community. Their story informed discussions of child protection, isolation, and patriarchal abuse, becoming a case study in law, psychology, and sociology. Scholars analyzed their strategic response to prolonged abuse, highlighting their intelligence, moral reasoning, and capacity for deliberate action. The Byrd sisters became a model for how victims could exercise agency under extreme constraints, demonstrating that survival required not only endurance, but thoughtful, calculated decision-making. In private, the sisters reflected on what life might have been if Prudence had survived, or if their mother had lived longer. Their reflections were tinged with sorrow, but tempered by gratitude for the lessons and strategies that Prudence had imparted. Prudence's foresight and courage had directly enabled their survival, ensuring that the sisters could navigate life with intelligence, moral clarity, and self-protection. In this sense, Prudence lived on through the decisions, actions, and ethical frameworks of her surviving sisters. As decades passed, the Byrd sisters continued their careful stewardship of the homestead and their private lives. Mercy maintained meticulous records. Temperance cultivated her herbal knowledge, and Clarity produced art that captured the emotional landscape of their history. They remained vigilant, aware of potential threats, and dedicated to ethical action, recognizing that freedom required constant attention. Their lives, while quiet and deliberate, were rich with purpose, reflection, and intentionality. Prudence's journal, alongside Mercy's annotations, remained central to their sense of identity and moral compass. Beyond historical importance, the journals served as guides for navigating ethical dilemmas, maintaining awareness, and preserving autonomy. Writing had been a tool of survival, empowerment, and justice, a legacy that endured across the sisters' lives. Each entry, each reflection, reinforced the lessons learned under extraordinary duress, and ensured that their experiences would inform future generations. The sisters also found moments of joy, connection, and shared ritual, gardening, preparing meals, reading together, and quietly observing the natural world became daily practices that reinforced autonomy, agency, and emotional resilience. Through these routines, they demonstrated that life after trauma could still contain meaning, beauty, and purpose. Each act was deliberate, a reaffirmation of control over their environment and their lives. Over time, the story of the Byrd sisters became a touchstone for understanding resilience, justice, and moral reasoning under extreme conditions. Their actions were cited in legal texts, psychological studies, and historical analyses as examples of calculated, ethical agency in the face of prolonged abuse. They demonstrated that victims could exercise intelligence, maintain ethical standards, and achieve justice without succumbing to lawlessness or despair. The mountains, once a site of captivity and fear, had become a place of reclamation. The land itself symbolized survival, resilience, and the persistence of life after horror. Walking the homestead, the sisters recognized both the dangers they had overcome and the strength they had cultivated. They honored Prudence's memory through careful observation, disciplined routines, and intentional living, ensuring that her foresight and courage remained an active presence in their lives. Through decades of deliberate living, reflection, and preservation, mercy, temperance, and clarity, Byrd transformed trauma into documentation, fear into strategy, and victimhood into survival. They remained vigilant, precise, and enduring, demonstrating that intelligence, courage, and moral reasoning could outlast brutality. Their legacy was not only a tale of horror, but a blueprint for resilience, ethical action, and justice in the face of unimaginable adversity. Even as time advanced and the world around them changed, the Byrd sisters' lives remained a testament to the human capacity for adaptation, strategy, and moral fortitude. They showed that survival was intellectual, emotional, and moral, and that enduring justice could be pursued through careful planning, documentation, and ethical reasoning. In the mountains, amid the winds and trees that had once seemed like a prison, they had built a life defined by autonomy, reflection, and purpose, a life that transformed horror into enduring strength. Though the sisters had reclaimed control over their own lives, they remained deeply aware of the shadows cast by their father's crimes. Every visitor to the homestead, every sound in the mountains, reminded them of vigilance and prudence. They did not live in fear, but in careful attention. Each day was an exercise in awareness, a practice of ensuring that their autonomy remained intact and that the lessons of the past were never forgotten. Mercy's journals grew longer, not only recording practical details, but also reflections on morality, justice, and human nature. Each entry reinforced her understanding of strategy and foresight, documenting insights that could serve future generations facing similar threats. Tempering their experiences with acts of normalcy became a deliberate form of healing. Temperance's herbal practices extended beyond the practical. They were meditative, intentional, and instructive. She taught local girls the art of observation, preparation, and self-care. Her lessons were subtle, emphasizing empowerment rather than intimidation. Through careful mentorship, she created a small network of resilience that quietly rippled through the surrounding communities. The sisters' influence, though largely invisible, began to manifest in subtle ways that ensured knowledge of survival and moral reasoning persisted beyond their immediate circle. Clarity continued to use art as both expression and pedagogy. Her works evolved from depicting trauma to exploring themes of justice, autonomy, and human resilience. Through exhibitions in private salons and small academic gatherings, her pieces communicated the psychological landscape of prolonged abuse without sensationalizing it. She offered insight into how trauma could shape ethical and strategic thinking, translating lived experience into visual narratives that could teach, caution, and inspire. Art became a bridge between experience and understanding, enabling viewers to confront the emotional and moral complexities of human suffering. Despite decades of reflection and accomplishment, the sisters never allowed complacency. They recognized that isolation, knowledge, and discipline had protected them once, and the same principles could protect others. Each decision, from planting herbs to managing their domestic environment, was calculated to maximize control and minimize vulnerability. Their life was a continuous exercise in measured action, a testament to the idea that freedom, once regained, required constant attention and disciplined execution. The Byrd sisters also engaged with the broader world cautiously. They provided insights to legal scholars, psychologists, and historians who sought to understand how extreme abuse could be survived and documented. They spoke with precision, avoiding sensationalism, emphasizing rational thought, moral reasoning, and the necessity of evidence-based action. Their testimonies became crucial in shaping academic and legal understanding of the intersection between trauma, autonomy, and strategic response. Each engagement reinforced the sisters' belief that survival was not enough. The knowledge they had gained had to be transmitted carefully, thoughtfully, and ethically. Though they avoided public attention, they were not blind to its consequences. Local communities regarded the sisters with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and respect. Stories of the Byrd household became part of regional folklore, often distorted, but always anchored in the undeniable reality of Prudence's journal and the sisters' subsequent actions. The sisters accepted that myth-making was inevitable, but remained committed to ensuring that the core truths, the methodical documentation, calculated action, and ethical framework, remained intact. They understood that the line between legend and fact could be blurry, but their careful records provided an unassailable anchor of truth. Emotionally, the sisters cultivated deliberate support structures. They relied on one another for guidance, reflection, and accountability. Decisions were never made impulsively. Every choice was weighed and considered collectively, reflecting a shared commitment to reason, justice, and survival. Even in moments of grief, they maintained their framework of ethical decision-making. Prudence's example guided them, reminding them that foresight, documentation, and deliberate action could transform despair into control and vulnerability into strategic advantage. The sisters' experiences also informed their views on law, justice, and societal responsibility. They recognized that isolation and secrecy had allowed Ezekiel's crimes to persist, and that community complicity, whether through silence or fear, had played a role in the perpetuation of abuse. Their reflections on these failures informed both Mercy's writings and the sisters' personal ethics. They developed a philosophy rooted in the principle that moral and ethical responsibility extended beyond survival. It encompassed awareness, action, and the deliberate documentation of injustice. Practical survival skills remained central to the sisters' daily lives. The mountains were unpredictable, and the sisters understood that their autonomy required both intellectual and physical preparedness. They honed skills in herbalism, foraging, building, and observation. Every practice, every exercise, was informed by the memory of captivity and the knowledge that foresight could prevent future harm. Survival was not a passive state. It was a continuous, active practice that required attention, intelligence, and strategic planning. Throughout their later years, the sisters reflected often on Prudence's final writings. Those pages, hidden for more than a decade, had provided a roadmap not only for survival but also for moral reasoning. Prudence's insistence on evidence, precision, and foresight became a guiding principle. Mercy, Temperance, and Clarity realized that their lives, shaped by horror and survival, could serve as both a warning and a lesson. They documented carefully, educated cautiously, and lived deliberately, transforming trauma into actionable knowledge. As time progressed, the sisters began mentoring select individuals in both ethical reasoning and practical skills. Their guidance was subtle, strategic, and deliberate, designed to empower without fostering dependency. They instructed on the importance of observation, ethical decision-making, and documentation as tools for survival and justice. Each lesson emphasized foresight and strategy, demonstrating that resilience was an active process, and that ethical action required careful, deliberate thought. Even in their quiet moments, the sisters maintained a connection to the lessons of the past. Walking the mountains, tending gardens, or observing wildlife, they remained attuned to patterns, signals, and potential threats. Their lives were shaped by vigilance and reflection, but also by a profound commitment to ethical and deliberate living. Prudence's foresight had enabled them to survive not only their father's cruelty, but also the moral and psychological challenges of navigating a world in which justice was neither guaranteed nor automatic. In the final reflection of their lives, the Byrd sisters embodied the synthesis of survival, morality, and foresight. They had endured the unimaginable, transformed trauma into documentation, and used intelligence and ethics to reclaim autonomy. Their story was a testament to human resilience, strategic thinking, and moral courage. Beyond survival, they demonstrated that deliberate action, grounded in ethical reasoning and informed by careful observation, could transform oppression into empowerment, fear into foresight, and despair into enduring strength. The Byrd sisters' legacy persisted not as a tale of horror alone, but as a blueprint for ethical survival, careful documentation, and strategic justice. They taught that autonomy required vigilance, that morality required deliberation, and that evidence and foresight could turn even the darkest circumstances into opportunities for resilience, understanding, and eventual justice. Their lives, carefully lived and meticulously recorded, became enduring proof that intelligence, ethical reasoning, and deliberate action could outlast brutality, reclaim freedom, and shape a legacy that would endure far beyond the mountains in which it had been forged. Over time, the sisters' lives took on a rhythm that balanced memory, purpose, and quiet resilience. Mercy, temperance, and clarity never allowed themselves to forget the lessons of their captivity, the horror of their father's abuse, or the meticulous planning that had allowed them to survive. Their past informed every choice, from how they managed their homestead to the way they interacted with others. They understood that vigilance and discipline were not merely survival tactics, but principles of ethical living. Every action was deliberate, calculated, and measured against the moral framework Prudence had established in her journal. The sisters also found a subtle but profound sense of community through selective engagement. They did not seek attention or notoriety, yet they quietly influenced those who came into their orbit. Local families, scholars, and even law enforcement officials who visited the mountains were educated through conversation, observation, and example. The Byrd sisters became living proof of the consequences of unchecked abuse, the importance of evidence, and the value of resilience. They did not sensationalize their story. Instead, they demonstrated through action that survival required intelligence, foresight, and ethical reasoning. Mercy's writings became increasingly philosophical. She reflected on justice, morality, and human behavior, connecting her lived experience to broader questions of ethical governance, family responsibility, and community accountability. Her journals, once private, were carefully curated as a moral and strategic archive. They documented not only their father's crimes, but also the sisters' ongoing reflections on justice, autonomy, and responsibility. She emphasized that true empowerment came not from retaliation alone, but from sustained awareness, deliberate action, and careful observation. Temperance's focus remained grounded in the practical, translating her knowledge of herbs, medicine, and natural observation into structured teaching. She mentored small groups of girls in the mountains, passing on practical knowledge of survival while emphasizing critical thinking and ethical discernment. She taught them to observe their environment, make calculated decisions, and question authority when it threatened personal autonomy or moral boundaries. Her mentorship was subtle but profound, planting seeds of resilience that extended far beyond the Byrd homestead. Clarity, having matured into a disciplined and thoughtful adult, continued to use art as both expression and pedagogy. Her works explored complex moral landscapes, illustrating the consequences of abuse, the strategies of survival, and the intricacies of human behavior under duress. Exhibitions were limited, deliberate, and often private, designed to challenge viewers to think critically and empathetically. Through her art, Clarity conveyed lessons about foresight, justice, and resilience that words alone could not capture, transforming trauma into a medium for reflection and instruction. The sisters never lost their attention to detail. Daily routines, meticulous records, and careful observation became second nature. Each year, they reviewed Prudence's journal and their own notes, ensuring that every memory, every lesson, and every act of deliberate strategy remained accessible and intact. This practice was both cathartic and preventative. It reinforced their understanding of cause and effect, of ethical action, and of the consequences of inattention. They recognized that their survival depended not only on physical safety, but also on mental discipline, strategic thinking, and moral clarity. Legally and historically, the Byrd sisters' story became a cornerstone for understanding abuse, trauma, and ethical response. Scholars and legal professionals reference Prudence's journal and the meticulous records kept by the surviving sisters as pioneering examples of evidence-based advocacy and self-protection. The trial of Ezekiel Byrd became a case study in how careful documentation, strategic action, and moral reasoning could transform victims into agents of justice. The sisters' actions highlighted that intelligence, foresight, and ethical reflection could serve as powerful tools in both survival and societal reform. Emotionally, the sisters forged bonds that transcended ordinary sibling relationships. Shared trauma had created a deep, unspoken understanding between them, and each decision was filtered through a collective ethical lens. They held one another accountable, provided guidance, and offered support without hierarchy or coercion. Their interdependence was a conscious choice, a deliberate cultivation of trust, collaboration, and mutual protection. It demonstrated that survival and autonomy could coexist with empathy, care, and shared responsibility. As the decades passed, the Byrd sisters became symbols not of sensationalized horror, but of strategic resilience, ethical fortitude, and moral clarity. Visitors to the mountains often remarked on their quiet authority, their deliberate movements, and the air of careful control that surrounded the homestead. They were neither feared nor idolized. They were respected for their intelligence, discipline, and capacity to translate trauma into reasoned action. Each interaction reinforced the principle that survival required both awareness and deliberate strategy, and that ethical and rational decision-making could convert even the darkest past into a framework for justice and empowerment. In the final years of their lives, the sisters focused increasingly on the transmission of knowledge. Mercy, temperance, and clarity ensured that their documentation, teachings, and reflections were preserved in forms that could outlast them. They trained select individuals in the mountains, teaching principles of observation, strategic action, and ethical reflection. Prudence's original journal, carefully protected for decades, was copied and catalogued with annotations that emphasized lessons learned, moral reasoning, and the necessity of evidence. The sisters recognized that knowledge was power, and that sharing it carefully could prevent the repetition of abuse elsewhere. Though the shadows of their father's crimes never fully disappeared, the sisters transformed them into a framework for resilience, strategy, and moral insight. Every memory, every reflection, and every action was informed by the lessons of the past. They demonstrated that survival was not merely the absence of harm, but the active cultivation of autonomy, ethical reasoning, and foresight. Their lives illustrated that intelligence, morality, and deliberate action could overcome even the most oppressive circumstances, transforming trauma into enduring wisdom. By the end of their lives, the Byrd sisters had created a legacy that was both profound and practical. They had survived unspeakable horror, used intelligence and strategy to reclaim their autonomy, and translated their experience into lessons for future generations. Prudence's voice, preserved in her journal, had guided them from beyond the grave, enabling them to act deliberately, ethically, and strategically. Their story became more than a narrative of survival. It was a blueprint for understanding, responding to, and preventing abuse, offering practical and moral lessons that transcended the mountains and the era in which they lived. In their final reflections, the sisters were united in the knowledge that their actions had prevented further harm, ensured justice, and preserved a record of truth. They had lived deliberately, acted ethically, and maintained vigilance, transforming a history of oppression into a legacy of empowerment and moral clarity. The Byrd sisters' lives were a testament to the power of foresight, strategy, and ethical reasoning, proving that intelligence and morality could prevail even in the darkest circumstances. Their story endured not as sensationalized horror, but as a guide for resilience, justice, and the careful, deliberate exercise of autonomy. In the years following the trial, mercy, temperance, and clarity carefully shaped lives that honored Prudence's legacy. Each day was a deliberate act of remembrance and resilience. They tended their homestead with exacting attention, preserving not only the land but also the history embedded within it. Every tool, every structure, and every corner of the house held memories of their struggle and lessons for survival. The sisters understood that their environment could teach as much as it sheltered, and they transformed it into a living archive of strategy, endurance, and ethical reflection. The sisters maintained strict routines, knowing that structure provided safety and mental clarity. Each morning, they would rise before sunrise, inspect the homestead, and check their records. Mercy would review notes from the previous day, tracking any inconsistencies or signs of neglect in their daily management. Temperance inspected the garden, ensuring that medicinal herbs and food crops thrived, while noting subtle changes in plants that could indicate health or environmental shifts. Clarity spent hours documenting observations of both nature and human behavior, filling journals with reflections, drawings, and tactical analyses of events, people, and interactions in their community. Every action reinforced vigilance, precision, and foresight, skills honed through years of surviving Ezekiel Byrd. The sisters also became teachers in their own way, quietly mentoring local girls and young women. Their lessons were practical but profound, emphasizing observation, analytical thinking, and ethical discernment. Mercy would explain how meticulous documentation could protect individuals from exploitation or injustice. Temperance taught the value of self-reliance, the medicinal properties of plants, and the need to anticipate consequences. Clarity shared art and storytelling as tools to explore morality, human behavior, and strategic thinking. In each case, they emphasized autonomy, responsibility, and careful action, instilling in their students the lessons learned from years of captivity and careful planning. While they rarely spoke openly about the past, the sisters' reputations grew quietly. Outsiders who visited the mountains described them as unusually intelligent, disciplined, and formidable. People sensed a deliberate order to their lives, a depth of understanding beyond ordinary experience. Those who observed closely noticed the subtle ways the sisters asserted authority and control over their environment without dominance or aggression. Their legacy of resilience, intelligence, and moral clarity became as tangible as the homestead itself. Socially, the Byrd sisters were selective but intentional. They cultivated relationships that reinforced their principles and provided support without threatening autonomy. Neighbors and visitors were treated with hospitality and care, yet the sisters never relinquished control over their own lives. Every interaction was evaluated for safety, trust, and alignment with their ethical framework. In this way, the sisters extended the lessons of vigilance, foresight, and deliberate action into human relationships, demonstrating that power need not be coercive, but could be exercised responsibly, thoughtfully, and strategically. Emotionally, the sisters remained intertwined in a network of mutual accountability. They processed grief, fear, and trauma collectively, providing each other support and perspective. They reinforced Prudence's lessons on evidence, strategy, and ethical reasoning, ensuring that no impulsive decision could undermine their autonomy or morality. They celebrated small victories, maintained rituals of remembrance, and continuously reflected on their experiences to draw lessons for the future. Each sister contributed uniquely. Mercy provided organization and critical analysis, Temperance ensured practical survival and resilience, and Clarity transformed observation into reflective art and teaching. Together, they were a self-sufficient and morally coherent unit. The sisters also became advocates in subtle but enduring ways. They wrote letters, shared knowledge selectively, and contributed to local understanding of abuse and survival strategies. They ensured that Prudence's journal, along with their own records, were carefully archived. They allowed scholars, law enforcement officials, and trusted researchers to access these materials, understanding the importance of evidence, documentation, and critical reflection for preventing similar tragedies elsewhere. In doing so, they extended their influence beyond their mountains, shaping conversations about justice, morality, and ethical responsibility for generations to come. Years passed, and the sisters grew older, their lives marked by steady routine, reflection, and measured engagement with the world. They never allowed complacency to creep in, maintaining vigilance over both the homestead and their own moral framework. They continued to monitor the land, the health of their crops and animals, and the ethical quality of interactions in their community. Their lived experience reinforced that safety, autonomy, and justice required constant attention, deliberate thought, and the careful application of knowledge. The Byrd sisters' story, once confined to the horrors of the cellar and the pages of Prudence's journal, transformed over time into a narrative of resilience, intelligence, and moral reasoning. Their lives became living testimony to the power of foresight, strategic thinking, and ethical reflection. They demonstrated that trauma, however profound, could be translated into knowledge, vigilance, and constructive action. They proved that intelligence combined with morality could not only ensure survival, but also prevent future harm and influence broader understanding. In their final years, the sisters focused on consolidation and preservation. They organized Prudence's journal, their own writings, and relevant artifacts into a coherent archive designed to outlast them. Each item was carefully labeled, annotated, and stored, ensuring that future generations could access a record of both abuse and survival. The sisters understood the power of evidence, the importance of strategic documentation, and the moral imperative to ensure that their experiences would serve as instruction rather than merely cautionary tales. Through this deliberate work, the sisters achieved a quiet form of immortality. Their legacy was not sensationalized horror, but careful, reasoned, and ethical documentation of the human capacity for resilience, strategy, and justice. Scholars, legal experts, and students who later studied the Byrd sisters' materials noted their meticulous approach, the clarity of their thinking, and the precision of their records. The sisters' experience became a framework for understanding abuse, trauma, and the ethical application of intelligence in crisis situations. By the end of their lives, Mercy, Temperance, and Clarity had created a life that transcended the suffering inflicted upon them. They demonstrated that careful planning, ethical reasoning, and strategic action could transform trauma into resilience, empowerment, and moral clarity. Prudence's journal, once a secret testimony to abuse, had guided them from childhood into adulthood, shaping their decisions, actions, and worldview. The sisters became exemplars of intelligence, ethical fortitude, and strategic survival, leaving behind a legacy of empowerment, foresight, and deliberate justice that would endure far beyond their lifetimes. Even as their physical presence faded from the mountains, the principles they embodied, vigilance, ethical reasoning, strategic planning, and resilience, continued to influence those who encountered their legacy. The homestead, journals, and carefully preserved records became educational tools, demonstrating that the consequences of abuse could be documented, understood, and mitigated. The Byrd sisters' lives illustrated that survival was not only about enduring harm, but about transforming experience into knowledge, strategy, and moral authority. Their story, preserved in meticulous records and living example, became more than a historical narrative. It became a manual for ethical survival. It demonstrated that intelligence, foresight, and deliberate action could overcome even the most oppressive circumstances, that trauma could be transformed into agency, and that moral clarity could guide even the most calculated strategic decisions. The Byrd sisters, once victims of unimaginable abuse, had become exemplars of ethical power, resilience, and foresight, their legacy etched into both human history and moral consciousness. In their final years, mercy, temperance, and clarity lived with a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with the horror of their early lives. They continued to maintain the homestead with deliberate care, preserving the tools, journals, and artifacts that documented both their father's cruelty and their own calculated survival. Each day was filled with purposely tending crops, maintaining records, and ensuring that the lessons of their experience would endure. The sisters had transformed the mountains from a place of terror into a sanctuary of resilience, knowledge, and ethical practice. Their reputations became almost legendary in the surrounding counties. Travelers and neighbors spoke of the Byrd sisters with a mixture of awe and respect, recognizing their intelligence, discipline, and moral authority. Though they rarely discussed their past publicly, the sisters' presence alone communicated a story of survival and justice. Their careful attention to detail in all aspects of life, from food preparation to record keeping, demonstrated that their intelligence was both practical and strategic. Every action was deliberate, reinforcing lessons learned under years of abuse and captivity. The sisters' mentorship of younger women and girls continued in subtle but impactful ways. They shared knowledge of herbs, survival techniques, and ethical reasoning, emphasizing observation, strategic thinking, and moral discernment. Mercy instructed in documentation and critical thinking, teaching that evidence and record keeping could protect one from injustice. Temperance emphasized practical survival skills and self-reliance, while clarity taught storytelling, reflection, and moral analysis. Together, the sisters instilled a philosophy of autonomy, vigilance, and ethical action, empowering a new generation to navigate both visible and hidden dangers. In their personal lives, the sisters remained deeply intertwined, sustaining a network of accountability, support, and emotional stability. They processed grief, fear, and trauma collectively, drawing strength from one another, and from Prudence's enduring example. Rituals of remembrance for their sister and of reflection on past suffering became daily practices, ensuring that their memories were preserved and honored. By maintaining these routines, they reinforced the principles of foresight, responsibility, and deliberate action that had guided them from childhood. The sisters also became quiet advocates for justice. They allowed select scholars, law enforcement officials, and researchers to access Prudence's journal and their own meticulous records, understanding that documentation could prevent future abuse. In doing so, they extended the impact of their survival beyond the mountains, influencing broader understanding of trauma, resilience, and ethical decision-making. Their efforts demonstrated that evidence, careful observation, and strategic action could serve both as protection and as a moral imperative. Over time, The Byrd homestead became both a historical site and a center for learning. The journals, artifacts, and detailed records were organized for study, ensuring that Prudence's testimony and the sisters' own documentation would educate generations. Scholars noted the extraordinary clarity, intelligence, and ethical reasoning displayed throughout the materials. The meticulous dating, cross-referencing, and careful observation reflected a level of cognitive sophistication that was remarkable, particularly given the circumstances under which the sisters had lived. Even as age slowed their physical movements, the sisters remained intellectually active. They continued to analyze events, anticipate outcomes, and apply lessons from their past to daily life. Prudence's journal had taught them the power of foresight, the importance of documentation, and the necessity of ethical reasoning. They applied these lessons to every aspect of their lives, from personal safety to community engagement. Their existence became a living demonstration of the principle that intelligence, combined with moral clarity, could overcome even the most oppressive circumstances. In the final chapters of their lives, the sisters focused on ensuring that their legacy was secure. They refined their archives, annotated key documents, and prepared detailed instructions for future custodians. Each item was labeled, cross-referenced, and preserved, ensuring that the story of abuse, survival, and justice would remain intact. This careful preparation reflected their lifelong commitment to strategy, precision, and ethical responsibility. They understood that the past could teach, warn, and guide, but only if it was documented and preserved thoughtfully. As the sisters aged, their influence extended beyond immediate family and community. Legal scholars, historians, and social workers studied their records to better understand patterns of abuse, resilience, and strategic survival. The Byrd sisters' story became a case study in both the human capacity for cruelty and the extraordinary power of foresight, intelligence, and ethical action. Prudence's journal, once hidden and secret, became a touchstone for understanding how meticulous documentation and strategic thinking could protect victims and inform justice. Mercy, temperance, and clarity ultimately lived full lives marked not by the suffering inflicted upon them, but by the principles they upheld: intelligence, moral clarity, resilience, and deliberate action. Their careful preservation of evidence, their mentoring of younger generations, and their meticulous management of their homestead ensured that their story would endure as both a warning and an inspiration. They demonstrated that trauma, when met with strategy, ethical reasoning, and collaboration, could be transformed into empowerment and legacy. When the sisters passed away, one by one, their homestead and archives became a permanent record of their lives and the horrors they overcame. The journals, tools, and carefully maintained records were donated to historical societies and research institutions, ensuring that Prudence's voice and the sisters' actions would continue to educate and guide. The artifacts, once instruments of trauma, became symbols of resilience, intelligence, and moral fortitude. The Byrd sisters' story ultimately transcended its origins in violence and oppression. It became a narrative of survival, strategy, and ethical responsibility. Their lives demonstrated that even in the face of systematic abuse, careful planning, intelligence, and moral reasoning could reclaim autonomy and ensure justice. Prudence's journal, the foundation of their knowledge and strategy, guided them from childhood into old age, transforming trauma into structured action and enduring influence. Through meticulous preservation, teaching, and demonstration, the sisters ensured that the lessons of their lives, vigilance, foresight, ethical reasoning, and strategic action, would endure. The mountains that had once been a prison became a sanctuary and a classroom. Their story inspired generations to understand the importance of evidence, the power of strategy, and the necessity of moral clarity in confronting injustice. Mercy, temperance, and Clarity Byrd, once victims of unimaginable cruelty, became exemplars of resilience, intelligence, and deliberate ethical action. Their legacy, carefully documented and preserved, continues to teach that even in the darkest circumstances, knowledge, strategy, and ethical reasoning can triumph. The Byrd sisters' tale, from the horror of the cellar to the disciplined wisdom of their final years, stands as a testament to the human capacity for survival, foresight, and justice. Their lives embody the principle that trauma, when met with intelligence and ethical action, can be transformed into a force for protection, education, and moral authority. Prudence's journal, the foundation of their strategy, ensured that the story of abuse, resistance, and deliberate justice would never be forgotten. In every entry, in every preserved artifact, and in the lives they led, the Byrd sisters demonstrated that resilience is not merely survival. It is the calculated, ethical application of knowledge, foresight, and moral clarity to reclaim life from oppression and create enduring legacy. Even decades after their father's imprisonment, the echoes of the Byrd sisters' ordeal reverberated through the surrounding communities. Historians and folklorists visiting the mountains spoke of the sisters with a mix of reverence and incredulity, chronicling their extraordinary blend of intelligence, courage, and moral rigor. Locals still whispered about the homestead, where the tools of abuse had been turned against the abuser, and while many found the story horrifying, others recognized in the sisters a lesson in the limits of human cruelty and the power of resilience. Mercy, temperance, and clarity made deliberate choices to live quietly, maintaining routines that honored Prudence's memory. Each day began with careful observation, checking crops, assessing weather, and tending to daily tasks with precision. But beneath these ordinary actions lay a deliberate philosophy of preparedness. Every meal, every note, every observation was framed with purpose, reflecting the strategic thinking that had saved them in their youth. They understood that vigilance was not only necessary for survival, but also a moral responsibility. The lessons of abuse had to be preserved, understood, and shared with care. The sisters also ensured the broader community benefited from their experience. They mentored young women who sought guidance in practical skills and ethical reasoning. Mercy taught methods of documentation and evidence preservation, showing that detailed records could safeguard autonomy and ensure accountability. Temperance shared knowledge of herbs, nutrition, and survival, emphasizing careful preparation and the consequences of miscalculation. Clarity focused on storytelling, reflection, and ethical deliberation, helping others understand the importance of moral clarity and critical thinking. Through these lessons, the Byrd sisters transformed their personal trauma into a tool for education and empowerment. Occasionally, researchers requested access to Prudence's journal and the sisters' meticulous archives. Each request was evaluated with care, ensuring that only those who approached with respect and genuine intent could study the materials. The sisters wanted Prudence's story to teach, not to sensationalize. They emphasized that the journal's value lay in its meticulous documentation and moral insight, illustrating how observation, foresight, and ethical reasoning could protect the vulnerable. The Byrd homestead itself became a living classroom. Scholars and students studying social behavior, trauma, and resilience visited to examine the artifacts, from the journals and chains to the daily records of the sisters' activities. The environment reflected the same meticulous order the sisters had imposed during their youth. Every item stored with care, every record dated and cross-referenced. The meticulous preservation of evidence became both a symbol and a practical tool, showing that knowledge, combined with strategy, could transform even the darkest past into a source of education and moral clarity. In their private lives, the sisters continued to reinforce the values that had sustained them. They maintained strong interpersonal bonds, creating a support system built on trust, collaboration, and shared purpose. Each sister contributed her unique skills and insights, ensuring that the group operated as a cohesive, intelligent unit. This network of mutual support allowed them to process grief, manage daily challenges, and continue Prudence's work of documentation and observation. Their lives became a testament to the idea that intelligence, strategy, and moral clarity, when exercised collectively, could overcome even systemic cruelty. Despite advancing age, the sisters retained remarkable mental acuity. Mercy continued to manage records with painstaking precision. Temperance oversaw practical operations on the homestead, and Clarity guided reflection and analysis. Together, they ensured that Prudence's legacy endured not just as a historical record, but as a living philosophy of resilience and ethical action. They demonstrated that survival was not simply endurance, but the application of deliberate intelligence, foresight, and moral reasoning to shape one's circumstances and protect others. When Mercy, Temperance, and Clarity eventually passed, their legacy was carefully safeguarded. The journals, records, and artifacts were donated to historical societies, universities, and research institutions, ensuring that Prudence's voice and the sisters' lives would continue to educate future generations. The chains, once instruments of terror, became symbols of justice, resilience, and the strategic reversal of power. Visitors to the archives and the homestead learned not only about the horrors endured but also about the extraordinary capabilities of intelligence, planning, and ethical reasoning under extreme circumstances. The Byrd sisters' story ultimately transcended its origin in trauma. It became a narrative of empowerment, strategic thinking, and ethical responsibility. Their meticulous documentation, careful planning, and deliberate actions offered a model for navigating injustice, illustrating how evidence, strategy, and moral clarity could restore autonomy and safeguard vulnerable lives. Prudence's journal, the foundation of their survival and strategy, became a symbol of the enduring power of careful observation and ethical action. In the end, the Byrd sisters were remembered not as victims, but as exemplars of resilience and moral intelligence. Their lives demonstrated that even the most systematic cruelty could be countered through foresight, planning, and ethical reasoning. By turning the tools of abuse against their oppressor and meticulously documenting every detail, they preserved a story that educated generations about the limits of human cruelty and the extraordinary power of deliberate, intelligent action. Prudence's voice, once hidden in a hollowed Bible, now resonated across centuries. The journals, artifacts, and homestead bore witness to the sisters' courage, intelligence, and moral clarity. Their story taught that trauma could be transformed into strategy, suffering into empowerment, and secrecy into a legacy of knowledge and justice. Through the Byrd sisters, history understood that resilience is not passive survival, but the deliberate, intelligent, and ethical application of knowledge to reclaim autonomy, ensure justice, and leave an enduring impact on the world.